It was an honor to be asked to share an opening reflection with the gathering today, to really ground what we're doing here within a Jewish context. And when we're speaking specifically about domestic workers' rights and one's responsibilities if they're in the position of being an employer, is something that Judaism speaks about so much in so many places. In fact, it's really kind of hard to find a text that doesn't address it in some way. Just last week's Torah portion in Parashat Kedoshim, like we were just reading about this last week. In Leviticus 19, it says here, you shall not defraud your fellows, you shall not commit robbery, and the wages of a laborer shall not remain with you until morning. If you've hired someone for a specific purpose, it's incumbent upon the person who's hiring them to make sure that the person who they are employing receives their fair due, especially for someone who is living on day wages, someone who can't afford to wait another week or even another day to get paid. In a lot of ways, it's in Deuteronomy, when we're looking at Torah, where these laws really come forward the most strongly. In Deuteronomy 24, it says, you shall not abuse a needy and destitute laborer, whether they are a fellow Israelite or whether they're a stranger in one of the communities of your land. You must pay them out the wages due on the same day before the sun sets, because the worker is needy and urgently depends on it. Otherwise, a cry to the Eternal One will be issued against you, and you will incur guilt. That relationship between a worker and an employer is so profound that it has divine resonances. When someone entrusts another person with a contract, that's not just between two people, our tradition says. This is actually a resonance of a divine relationship. And we need to keep those trusts just as we would before God. The rabbis expand on this, and this is the last text that I'm going to lead to you. This, by the way, is not a text that I had previously encountered. So I was doing a little research on this issue today. This is from the words of the rabbis 2,000 years ago, from Bava Metzia 83a. Some porters were working for Rabbah Baba Hanan, and they broke a jug of wine. And after that, he seized their cloaks in repayment for the broken jug. The workers went before Rav with their complaints, and Rav said to Rabbah Baba Hanan, give them their clothing back. Rabbah Baba Hanan said to him, is that the law? And Rav said, yes, that is the law. We're guided by the principle, you should walk always in the paths of the good, Proverbs 2:20. So he gave them back their cloaks. And they said to him, we're poor. We troubled ourselves to work for you all day, and we're needy. Do we receive no wages for all our work? And immediately Rav said to him, go, give them their wages. And again, he said to Rav, is that the law? And Rav said, yes. As it says, you shall keep the ways of the righteous. There's no part of the human experience, we are told in Judaism, that is exempt from acting with righteousness. And really to strip the 2,000 years of rabbinic legislation out of this and an additional 500 to 1,000 years of Torah writing out of this, we're left with a very simple concept. We are all made in the divine image. Each and every one of us is equal before our Creator. The fact that we may be in a relationship with another person as being an employer or an employee is irrelevant. We are still required to act with righteousness. And this transcends any particular faith or creed. It's to recognize that all people, ultimately, each and every one of us, are holy. I'm so very grateful to those who arranged this talk as a way to remind us to keep that truth before us in all of our encounters, in all of our relationships. May we be inspired and guided through our study together, this Torat Chaim, this living Torah, to pursue justice and righteousness, so that all may thrive on this earth we share. Bruchim Habayim, welcome to all who've gathered.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Josh, and welcome again, everyone. I'm Karen Blumenfeld from Congregation Bethel, and I'm going to be the moderator tonight. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge Bethel member Nikki Meadow, who made tonight's program possible. This was her vision that's coming to fruition tonight. I also want to acknowledge Phoebe Gardner of the Mass Coalition of Domestic Workers, who assembled the wonderful panel that you're going to hear from this evening, the 4 speakers. And major appreciation goes to our Zoom host, Martin Brower, and to Beth Shine, Temple Administrator, who makes everything at Bethel possible. Tonight's program is sponsored by Congregation Bethel's Anti-Racism Working Group and Sanctuary Committee, and also in partnership with Congregation Dorsey Tzedek, for which we're very grateful. A couple of quick housekeeping items. First, keep your microphone muted throughout the program. Second, we wanted to let you know that questions are going to be handled at the end. There'll be a Q&A after all 4 speakers have spoken, but you can chat your questions at any time during the presentation to Phoebe Gardner. Phoebe, can you maybe raise your hand so people can see you? And Phoebe will take all the questions and handle them at the end after all the speakers. And if you're having technical difficulties, please chat Martin Brower, the Zoom host. So I want to begin by introducing our first speaker, Amy Mazer from the Mass Coalition of Domestic Workers. As a current employer of a house cleaner and having employed caregivers for her parents, Amy believes it's her responsibility to make sure that these workers are treated with the same rights and fairness that any worker in any workplace should have. Amy is a committed volunteer at the Mass Coalition of Domestic Workers. She has worked tirelessly to advocate for passage of the Domestic Workers' Bill of Rights in Massachusetts and at the national level. She's served on the board of the New England Jewish Labor Committee and on the National Committee of Hand in Hand, a network of employers of nannies, house cleaners, and home attendants working for dignified and respectful working conditions. Amy.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this particular panel this evening. I'm happy to be representing the Mass Coalition of Domestic Workers, or as we call it, MACDO. And I am the employer engagement volunteer for that organization. I'm here to speak this evening, as Karen said, to talk about my connection to this work as a domestic employer, what I've learned, how to keep learning, and how to share that information with you. So first and foremost, I want to start by saying I am a domestic employer. And I have been connected to, surrounded by, and engaging with domestic workers my whole life. As Karen mentioned, as an adult, I have hired house cleaners, and my family has hired caregivers for my in-laws and my parents. And when I was younger, I had house cleaners and babysitters and childcare workers in my life. In addition to being a domestic employer, I am a Jewish woman, strongly connected to my Jewish values. And as Rabbi Josh articulated in some of the texts that he shared, I wanted to add a few more of my values that feel important to me. And they are kavod habriot, which is dignity, the belief that all people have inherent value and should be treated with dignity. Kavod, respect, regard for the rights, feelings, abilities, and wishes of others. Kol Yisrael Arivim Zebazeh, communal responsibility, the need to take action and inspire others to create a community in which we can all take pride. In addition to being a domestic worker, a woman who wants to live her Jewish values, I am also a worker. So I know what it's like to work with dignity, respect, and a sense of purpose. And I know what it's like to work without that. Because of these 3 strong parts of me, I decided to become engaged with supporting domestic workers and to make a commitment so that workers who perform such an important and necessary role in our communities and in our lives will be recognized and valued as all workers should be. And that's what brought me to MACDO, the Coalition of Domestic Workers. MACDO is an organization that works to bring racial and social justice and dignity to all workers in our state by building partnerships, educating employers, and organizing with, advocating for, and empowering and developing the leadership of domestic workers. And MACDO was founded in 2010 by a steering committee made up of community organizations and worker centers dedicated to passing the Massachusetts Domestic Worker Bill of Rights, which was successfully passed in 2014 and enacted in 2015. So I want to share with you what I've learned and want to share. I'm not sure if I can see a show of hands, but I was wondering if people would be willing to either show their hands and demonstrate whether they are house cleaners, if they employ house cleaners, if they employ childcare workers, or if they employ personal care attendants. So I am seeing some hands. Before the program, I was also wondering how many of you had heard of the Massachusetts Domestic Worker Bill of Rights. And maybe you heard of it through your connection to Karen and Nikki, or through your connection through me at the Congregation Dorshey Tzedek, who is co-sponsoring this, but that was, but it's possible that you haven't, because many people have not heard of it in Massachusetts. So we wanted to make sure we're getting people educated. So what does it mean to be an employer? And perhaps if you have the ability, if you could just put in the chat what just one word that comes to mind when you say the word, or when I say the word employer, what's a word that comes to mind? People want to put the word in the chat, you're welcome to do that. But a word that I'd like to share is, so I see, okay. Responsibility, status differential beneficiary. Okay. Thank you. So I am going to focus on the word responsibility. So go back to thinking about yourself being a worker. You want to make sure that the person you hire, put yourself in this place, feels safe and protected, physically and emotionally, from exploitation, from abuse, harassment, and from physical injury. You want to make sure the person you hire, no matter the level of skill and experience, is treated equitably and with respect and dignity. You want to make sure the person you hire is paid fairly for their work, a living wage, not just a minimum wage. There's a particular and unique nature of care work as an employer. There's an interdependence. Both parties need and rely on each other. And of course, that's true in lots of different situations, but there's this much more personal nature and more intimate nature of this particular kind of work. And it's also in people's private homes. So the lines can feel less clear at times. But at the end of the day, this is an employer-employee relationship. So how do we keep learning to be the best employers we can be? Well, that's what the Domestic Worker Bill of Rights is for. It helps us to be better employers. The Domestic Worker Bill of Rights ensures that individuals who are most often immigrant women of color can work with dignity and respect and have a vehicle to redress their grievances in the event they are treated unfairly. The provisions of the law establish basic workplace rights in private homes, and among them, meal and rest breaks, clarity on what constitutes work time, job protected sick leave, privacy, freedom from discrimination, and sexual harassment. In addition to the Bill of Rights helping us be better employers, organizations do that too. And these organizations actually go beyond the law and help us be better than the floor, better than what the law expects us to do, but to be even better domestic employers. So there's the New England Jewish Labor Committee. Karen mentioned that I've been a part of that. And that particular organization was actively involved in the passage of the Domestic Worker Bill of Rights. And that's a social, if you have not heard of that already, that is a social justice organization within our community dedicated to building the power of workers through educating, mobilizing, and organizing the Jewish community, both inside and outside of the established labor movement, to effectively advocate for collective liberation and economic justice. And there's also an organization called Hand in Hand. And that organization, hold on one second, sorry. Make sure I can see the timer. Is a national network that comes together as caregivers, domestic workers, employers, family members, people with disabilities, and older adults to demand respect and dignity for care work in our homes. Hand in Hand shows the true power of solidarity and what can be accomplished when we work together along lines of difference. So these organizations, the Coalition of Domestic Workers, the New England Jewish Labor Committee, Hand in Hand, are all advocating for putting fair care into practice. And let me give you 3 tips that all of these organizations support. Again, going above the floor. So there's fair pay. And again, in Massachusetts, the minimum wage is $15 an hour currently. And we at these organizations and we at MACDO support considering $25 an hour as your rate of pay. And then another tip is clear communication and setting expectations. And MACDO can help individuals with understanding that, writing contracts and agreements as part of the work that we expect and feel is important as employers. We can also help you with the discussions you should feel free to have and the language you can use with the domestic worker or the person you are paying related to things like workers' comp coverage and paying a livable wage. These are reasonable conversations to have and appropriate for you as you want to be a good employer. And lastly, time off, which is paid sick days and vacation time. And again, MACDO can help you understand and figure out what those options are. And as an example of that, when COVID hit, those of us who were employers who were in a position to pay, who were continuing to work, continued to pay workers, even though they were not necessarily coming into your home for safety reasons for everyone concerned. So let me wrap up by saying that there are many resources available that we are going to share with you and lots of questions that you'll be able to ask during the Q&A period. But really what I want to end with is saying this is our chance to tamod in Hebrew, which is stand up, to support economic justice, worker justice, gender justice, immigrant justice, and to live our values. And I'd like to close with one quote from Maria Axner, who was the regional director of the New England Jewish Labor Committee when we were advocating for the Domestic Worker Bill of Rights. And she said, "This work is about looking inward and requires us to think about what it means to treat our employees justly. Even those of us who care deeply about our workers and do our best to treat them well may not be aware of some of the protections that all domestic workers need but do not have. In supporting domestic workers, we have a rich opportunity to examine our values and our actions." Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. Our next speaker is Kate Watkins. Kate is an Assistant Attorney General in the Fair Labor Division of the Massachusetts Office of Attorney General. She primarily handles cases involving the Massachusetts wage and hour and child labor laws. Kate joined the Attorney General's office in 2012, shortly after becoming an attorney. Before law school, she worked in legal services. She's a graduate of Harvard University and the Northeastern University School of Law. Kate.
All right, good evening. think I'll just take a moment and see if I can successfully share my screen. All right, hopefully. Oops.
Go to view and then slideshow, then we'll see your first slide.
Thank you. All right.
Or there's slideshow, actually. I see slideshow kind of in the middle.
All right. Thank you for bearing with me. So I am very pleased to be here with you tonight. This is a very interesting discussion for me too. I am going to be talking in contrast with Amy about that legal floor. So the obligations that we have when employing a domestic worker, right? Which does not preclude you going above and beyond those legal obligations. I just want to make a few basic comments. Let's see. I don't know if this is working, but a few general comments about the laws that I'm discussing and employees' rights in Massachusetts. So the wage and hour laws and the Domestic Worker Bill of Rights apply to anyone who works in Massachusetts, regardless of immigration status, regardless of whether someone is employed on or off the books, and also regardless of whether that person agreed maybe to be paid less than the law requires. So someone might say, oh, you don't have to pay me overtime, but that kind of agreement is void. So you still would be liable for any wages that should have been paid, even if the person at the time agreed to be paid less. When we get to the question and answer period, just be forewarned that there are limits to the kinds of questions I can answer and the information I can provide, because I can't provide legal opinions or legal advice, but I will try to provide as much insight as I can ethically. Let's see. All right. So the first thing that I wanted to do is describe what I mean when I say a domestic worker. Legally, two things have to be true for someone to be considered a domestic worker who's covered by the Domestic Worker Bill of Rights. One is that the person is providing domestic services. I think for the most part, this is not a controversial question, at least as far as the cases that I see. Cooking, cleaning, taking care of people in the home, particularly children or parents, providing the kind of basic care that one would expect a family member to provide. Those are all examples of domestic work. In addition to the type of the work the person performs, that person would also have to be an employee. So domestic worker here means an employee who provides domestic services, not someone who is in business for themselves, right? So to give an example, a household might employ, say, a house cleaner, right? And they decide all the terms of the employment, they hire the person, and they direct how the work is done. In contrast, as I might engage a house cleaner to perform these services, but that house cleaner is in business for themselves. They have a roster of clients, they decide their own schedule, they advertise their services, they decide the methods that they'll use to clean, they might bring their own equipment from house to house. So not every situation where someone's performing services in your home or domestic services in your home will be a situation where you're an employer or that person's an employee. Again, it's not something, that distinction might not matter as much to you when discussing the values and the relationship you want to have with this person, but that is part of the legal distinction of domestic workers. A domestic worker does not include casual babysitters, and it also does not include personal care attendants who are paid for through the Mass Health PCA program. Other personal care attendants or people performing those kinds of services would be considered domestic workers. So if you think the person in providing services in your home is a domestic worker, they are someone's employee, the question would then be, are you their employer? Going back to that example of a house cleaning service, it might be as a household that I'm engaging a person directly to provide those services. It might be that I'm hiring a company or engaging a business owner to provide those services, and that person hires people, sends them to clean client houses, handles things like payment and employment policies, hiring and firing, those kinds of decisions that as the client, I wouldn't have any say over. You can hire someone and be an employer, even if that person came to you through an agency. And it's possible for you to be a joint employer with an agency or a company. But that would really be if you're directing how that work is done, if you're determining the conditions of employment, if you're acting as an employer rather than a client. Not necessarily the cleanest of answers, but for the most part, from what we see, it's usually pretty clear who the employer is in these situations. All right. And then finally, I wanted to talk about some of the protections or obligations that we see most commonly in dispute in these cases involving domestic workers. So domestic workers are employees. They have all the protections that apply to employees in Massachusetts. This would be the minimum wage, which again, right now is no less than $15 per hour. They have a right to overtime if working more than 40 hours in a week. That's true whether the person's paid hourly or a salary. They're still entitled to overtime. There are limitations on deductions. So, for example, if an item is broken in the house, a wine jug, that kind of, and the employer is thinking about making a deduction from wages for the damage that was done, that kind of deduction is not permitted under the state wage and hour laws. The deductions are generally limited to something employees choose for their own benefits and deductions required by law, such as taxes or child support. There's then a class of obligations that apply to all domestic workers. These are a notice of rights of domestic workers under Massachusetts law. On our website, we have a sample notice that with brief descriptions of the different rights that apply under wage and hour and other employment laws. The Domestic Workers Bill of Rights also applies the state's anti-discrimination laws to domestic workers. Normally, only employers of, I think, 5 or 6 individuals are covered by those laws, but any domestic worker is covered. If you're employing a domestic worker at least 16 hours a week, then you're also obligated to make sure that you have a written agreement that sets forth the conditions of employment, things like job duties, schedule, the rate of pay, whether there are any, whether there's paid time off, and other details for live-in workers. Also, you would need to provide timesheets every 2 weeks for the employee to sign off on. Domestic workers employed at least 40 hours a week have a right to 1 day off each week and 2 consecutive days off each month. And then there's a variety of protections for live-in workers to make sure that the premises are adequate, and also to make provisions for them to have some place to live, say if the employment ends, if the employer terminates the employment, to prevent that worker from being left without housing. All right, so this is just a graphic representing the different tiers of obligations as employers. I don't know. Let's stop the share. And I think there's going to be a resource, a list of resources made available. On that would be our hotline, which anyone can call with questions about the law. And also the Attorney General's webpage that's devoted to information about domestic workers and the Domestic Workers Bill of Rights. There are sample agreements, sample timesheets, sample notices of rights, and a lot of the information that I've covered tonight, even in more detail. So I'm sure there will be questions later, but those are the basic points to keep in mind when employing people in your home. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. Our next speaker is Diego Lowe. Diego was a founder of the Metro West Worker Center, CASA, at its beginning in 2007. He has worked in immigrant worker organizing with farm workers and in urban areas in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Washington, D.C., New York, New Mexico, and Massachusetts. Diego reports that he never learned how to do anything more challenging than this work. Diego.
Thank you, folks, for being interested in addressing these issues and trying to do right by the folks who labor under your roofs. There are many different kinds of work that come under the category of domestic work. Nannies, live-in nannies especially, are a very different situation from the situations that Elsa was just describing. Different from sort of the elder care that 24-hour elder care where folks cycle in and out on 8 or 12-hour shifts. But as you have undoubtedly noticed, if this is part of your lives now, a great majority of the folks who are doing the work are in fact immigrant. And so I guess the stories that Elsa has just shared with you of her stories are valuable, are valuable to the extent they give you also a sense of the dynamic that immigrant workers can be working from. If people put up with these things because they don't have better choices, because they don't have the information, so there is a particularly important role for homeowners in doing what you can to assure yourselves of as much as you can for those who are working under your roof. I guess I want to step back for just a minute and share a few stories of what's happening at CASA and other worker centers around Massachusetts at the moment. Again, by way of trying to share what the dynamics are for an immigrant worker, and especially, there's a home health outfit not very far from CASA's office, where that we actually filed non-payment of wage complaints against some years ago. But in addition to just irregular payments and withholding payments, there were people who were promised certifications as CNAs and such of that sort, and long after they had taken the course, the program would refuse to give them the certificate of that, so they were sort of bound to the employer, because if they left, they were pretty convinced they would never get the certificate for the work they had I mean, for the training they had received. CASA has, for reasons that I don't fully understand, has seen more than double the number of complaints of non-payment in the last 12 months than we've seen at any other time in our existence. And there we have just a more cases than we can keep track of that are being systematically investigated, whether by the federal DOL or the state. And the amount of retaliation that's going on there, including when the investigation begins, telling workers that they have to open their own company, buy their own workers' comp insurance, and go out and get and then continue doing the job they were doing, for years before that. And I guess I'm telling you this again by way of trying to communicate the vulnerability of the folks who are working in our homes, and this is the medium within which the folks who are working with you are working. So I guess so I have a few thoughts for folks about what you can do if someone is cleaning your home, or someone is taking care of elderly family members or children. And that is, if two people come to clean your home, it may seem like a very informal relationship, and that they're friends, and there's an easy bantering and such as that. But as the story suggested, 80% of what you're paying the folks who clean may be ending up in one of their pockets. People are often paid by the house with no financial recognition, for instance, for the travel time between homes. So that often it doesn't add up to even minimum wage. So I guess to the extent that you're offering folks employment, I think you can find a way of asking who's calling the shots, who is the employer in this situation, and you can ask what the wage is for the employee in the process. I think perhaps even more important, again referring to Edsa's story, is confirming that, actually insisting on seeing the piece of paper that shows that the employer has a workers' comp policy. Because though Elsa was able to get care, her care was delayed several months, longer than usual, because the care had to be paid for out of the state's trust fund, for the workers' comp trust fund. So those are kind of proactive things homeowners can do to try to be assured that that the folks who are helping care for them and their family are actually excuse me just one second. Excuse me. We're working out of our office this evening, and people are coming to visit. So I think I've taken enough of your time. There'll be time for questions. If there are pieces of what we've said that are important to unpack, and let me hand the agenda back to the moderator.
Thank you so much, Diego, and thank you to all of the speakers.